Ardennes Forest, December 16, 1944, just after 30 hours. The sudden, concussive roar of massed artillery shattered the pre-dawn quiet, tearing through the thin veneer of American complacency that had settled over the front lines. This barrage, unprecedented in its scale and ferocity for months, signaled the opening of a massive German counteroffensive, a desperate gamble to reverse the tide of war, threatening to unhinge the Allied advance and prolong the conflict indefinitely. The stakes were immediate and existential: hold the line or face a potentially catastrophic collapse. Along a sparsely held sector near the village of Lanzerath, Private First Class William E. James, a forward observer with the 14th Cavalry Group, had been stirring from a fitful sleep, the cold seeping through his wool blanket. His initial impression of the sector had been one of deceptive tranquility. The dense fir forests and rolling hills had seemed to offer a natural, impenetrable barrier, fostering a sense of security among the weary troops. His role, normally one of routine observation and occasional target spotting, was about to be redefined by an onslaught of unimaginable proportions. For weeks, intelligence reports had hinted at German troop movements, but these had been largely dismissed as minor regroupings or defensive preparations. Unit diaries from the 106th Infantry Division, positioned directly in the path of the coming storm, recorded a prevailing belief that the Germans lacked the resources for any significant offensive action. This quiet confidence, born of months of steady Allied progress and a perceived superiority in material, had led to a thinning of forces in this particular sector, deemed unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. The reality, however, was a meticulously planned assault, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, involving 3 full German armies. Interrogation files from captured German officers later revealed that the plan's success hinged on achieving complete surprise and exploiting the perceived weakness of the American lines in the Ardennes. The sheer volume of ordnance now falling, estimated by preliminary damage reports to be hundreds of shells per minute across a narrow front, was designed not merely to suppress, but to obliterate resistance and sow panic. This initial artillery preparation, a hallmark of German offensive doctrine, was not a probing attack, but a full commitment. It targeted known strongpoints, communication lines, and suspected troop concentrations with chilling precision, based on months of aerial reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. The sound itself was a physical force, shaking the frozen earth, a stark, undeniable declaration that the quiet period was over, and a new, brutal chapter had begun. The damp earth of the Ardennes, November 1944, absorbed the muffled sounds of German engineering. Beneath the canopy of ancient pines, where the winter chill already bit deep, a new kind of preparation was underway, a deliberate and methodical assembly that defied the conventional wisdom of static front lines. This was not the hurried scramble of a retreating army, but the precise orchestration of a calculated offensive. Its movements cloaked by the very terrain that would soon witness its fury. For weeks, the dense forests had served as an impenetrable screen, concealing the steady influx of specialized equipment and trained personnel. Supply manifests, intercepted later by Allied intelligence, detailed the arrival of 105mm and 150mm howitzers, their barrels swathed in protective grease, alongside the heavier, more formidable 170mm K Morser and the 210mm K Mrs. 18. These were not merely field guns, they represented a significant concentration of heavy artillery, far exceeding the typical support allocated to a defensive sector. The logistical challenge of moving such ordnance through the heavily forested, snow-dusted terrain was immense. Unit diaries from the Volksgrenadier divisions, later recovered, spoke of long nights spent clearing narrow tracks, reinforcing temporary bridges. and camouflaging every sign of their passage. Each gun, often weighing several tons, was painstakingly maneuvered into position, its firing platform leveled and its ammunition stacked in carefully dug emplacements, all under the perpetual threat of Allied air reconnaissance, which remained largely oblivious to the scale of the hidden buildup. The crews themselves, drawn from seasoned artillery regiments and newly formed Volksartillerie corps, underwent intense, localized training. Interrogation files from captured German gunners revealed a focus on rapid deployment and sustained fire, emphasizing the critical role of surprise and shock effect. They practiced firing drills in complete darkness, using pre-registered targets and intricate range cards, their movements becoming a well-rehearsed ballet of coordinated effort, designed to unleash maximum devastation in the shortest possible time. Beyond the conventional artillery, a more sinister element was being prepared: the Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. These multi-barreled devices, capable of unleashing a volley of high-explosive or smoke rockets, were particularly effective in creating psychological terror and disrupting enemy formations. Production logs from the Rheinmetall-Borsig factories indicated a surge in Nebelwerfer output in late 1944, with thousands of rockets earmarked for the Western Front. A clear signal of an impending, unconventional bombardment. The tactical doctrine underpinning this deployment was a stark departure from the static trench warfare that had characterized much of the Western Front. German General Staff memoranda, later analyzed, outlined a strategy of concentrated fire designed to overwhelm enemy positions with an unprecedented volume of shells and rockets, followed by rapid infantry assaults. The sheer density of fire, it was theorized, would shatter American morale and create exploitable breaches in their lines, allowing for a swift breakthrough. The objective was not merely to inflict casualties, but to disorient and demoralize, to create a sense of chaos and helplessness among the American defenders. The chosen terrain, with its limited visibility and difficult lines of communication, would amplify the effect of the surprise bombardment, turning the familiar woods into a crucible of fire and shrapnel. The meticulous preparations, hidden beneath the unassuming quiet of the winter forest, were poised to unleash a storm of steel that would redefine the meaning of a quiet night. The woods, moments before a tableau of deceptive quiet, erupted. A sudden concussive wave of sound and light tore through the pre-dawn stillness, transforming the landscape into a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. American lines, settled into the rhythm of a night they believed secure, were caught in an instant by an artillery barrage unlike any they had experienced. Damage reports from the 3rd Battalion, 110th Infantry, would later detail the initial impact. Mortar rounds, primarily 81mm and 120mm, began the assault, saturating forward positions with a calculated ferocity. These were followed almost immediately by 75mm and 105mm high-explosive shells, tearing through the thin canopy and churning the earth into a deadly airborne slurry. The sheer volume of incoming ordnance suggested a meticulously planned and coordinated strike, not a probing attack. Interrogation files of captured German artillery spotters later confirmed the extensive preparatory work. Forward observers, often disguised and operating behind American lines for days, had meticulously mapped out troop concentrations, supply caches, and even individual foxholes. This intelligence, fed back to battery commanders, allowed for a precision targeting that maximized casualties and psychological impact. The German artillery, primarily the 105mm LEFH-18 howitzer and the 150mm SFH-18 howitzer, possessed a formidable rate of fire, capable of delivering sustained barrages of 6 to 8 rounds per minute per gun. The strategic implication was immediate and devastating. This was not a localized skirmish, but a full-scale offensive, designed to shatter American morale and disorganize their defenses before the main infantry assault. The suddenness and intensity of the bombardment aimed to create a vacuum of command and control, isolating units and preventing any coordinated response. The psychological toll of such an unceasing deluge of explosives was almost as crippling as the physical destruction, fostering a sense of helplessness and overwhelming dread among the besieged troops. The woods, now a landscape of splintered trees and burning undergrowth, continued to absorb the relentless hammering. Each explosion a punctuation mark in a terrifying new chapter. The initial reports reaching divisional headquarters were often fragmented, a series of frantic dispatches detailing an unprecedented ferocity. What began as distant glows on the horizon quickly escalated into an all-consuming conflagration. The forests that had offered concealment now serving as fuel. Unit diaries from the 90th Infantry Division, for instance, recorded an immediate and overwhelming shift in the battlefield's character, describing the sudden appearance of multiple, simultaneous fires erupting across wide areas. These were not the slow, creeping blazes of accidental ignition or artillery-induced brush fires. Instead, observers noted distinct points of origin, often marked by a brief, intense flash, followed by a rapid expansion of flame. The nature of the fires suggested a deliberate and highly effective incendiary mechanism, far beyond the capabilities of standard high-explosive fragmentation rounds. The sheer speed of ignition and spread was the defining characteristic, transforming dense woodland into an inferno within minutes. Technical examination of unexploded ordnance and post-attack reconnaissance photos revealed a consistent signature. The German Luftwaffe, through its Kampfgeschwader 51 and 53, was employing a new generation of incendiary bombs, primarily the Brandbomb 50, B-50, and the larger B-250. These munitions contained a thermite core, a mixture of finely powdered aluminum and iron oxide, designed for rapid high-temperature combustion. The casing was often magnesium alloy, which once ignited by the thermite, would burn fiercely, scattering molten metal and spreading secondary fires. Production logs from German armaments factories indicated a significant ramp-up in incendiary bomb output during late 1944, with monthly totals for B-50s exceeding 150,000 units by November. This marked a strategic shift, moving beyond precision targeting of industrial centers to area denial and psychological warfare on the battlefield. The sheer volume of these bombs, combined with their destructive efficiency, allowed for saturation attacks that could overwhelm conventional firefighting efforts and defensive positions. The strategic implication was profound. American and Allied forces, accustomed to fighting in and through wooded terrain, suddenly found these natural defenses turned against them. The smoke and heat created impenetrable barriers, disrupting lines of communication, forcing costly detours, and inflicting severe psychological trauma. The German High Command, through these incendiary barrages, aimed to slow the Allied advance, channel their movements, and demoralize troops already weary from sustained combat. The burning woods became a new, terrifying adversary. The crackle of flames, the acrid smoke, and the searing heat created an environment of inescapable dread. Retreating through the inferno was often as deadly as standing firm. The inferno, once ignited, moved with a terrifying speed that defied conventional understanding of forest fires. The dry undergrowth, centuries of accumulated leaf litter, and the resinous pines of the Hurtgenwald created a perfect fuel bed, a tinderbox awaiting only the spark. Within minutes of the initial artillery barrage, which included phosphorus rounds designed to ignite, small, isolated blazes coalesced into a roaring front, consuming everything in its path. Damage reports from the 28th Infantry Division, compiled days later, documented trees with trunks over a foot in diameter, completely consumed, reduced to smoldering stumps within an hour. The intense heat generated by the conflagration was such that it created its own localized weather patterns, drawing in oxygen from all directions and fanning the flames even further. Eyewitness accounts, recorded in unit diaries, frequently mention the air becoming unbreathable, thick with smoke and superheated particulate matter, long before the fire itself reached their positions. The sheer scale of the burning forest presented an immediate and insurmountable tactical problem. Fire breaks, hastily constructed by engineers in the preceding days, proved utterly useless against the advancing wall of flame, which often jumped gaps of 50 yards or more. The heat was so intense that ammunition caches, even those buried in shallow earth, detonated spontaneously, adding concussive blasts to the already deafening roar of the fire. The psychological impact on the troops was profound. Men who had endured weeks of relentless shelling and close-quarters combat found themselves facing an enemy that was both indiscriminate and unstoppable. The constant crackle and roar, the blinding smoke, and the searing heat eroded morale more effectively than any direct engagement. Combat stress reports indicate a sharp increase in cases of shell shock and psychological exhaustion during this period, directly attributed to the environmental trauma of the burning forest. Movement became almost impossible. Roads and trails, vital for resupply and reinforcement, were swallowed by the flames or rendered impassable by falling, burning trees. The dense smoke reduced visibility to mere feet, disorienting even the most experienced scouts and making coordinated maneuvers a deadly gamble. The forest, once a strategic asset providing cover and concealment, had become a fiery trap, isolating units and cutting them off from support. The medical implications were equally devastating. Casualties from burns and smoke inhalation mounted rapidly, often exceeding those from direct enemy fire in the initial hours of the blaze. Evacuation routes were choked, and the intense heat made it impossible for medics to reach many of the wounded. The field hospitals, already strained by the prolonged fighting, were overwhelmed by the influx of burn victims, whose care required specialized resources and expertise that were in short supply. The German defenders, though also affected by the smoke and heat, understood the terrain and the nature of the forest fire with a grim familiarity. Their positions, often dug deep into the earth, offered some protection from the immediate effects of the blaze, and they exploited the chaos to launch probing attacks against disoriented American units. The fire, in effect, became an unwitting ally, disrupting American command and control and creating a fog of war far thicker than any natural mist. The strategic objectives, already difficult to achieve, now seemed entirely out of reach. The advance, intended to be a decisive push, had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival against an elemental force. The forest, once a battleground, had become a pyre, consuming men and materiel with an indifferent fury. The woods burned, and the American lines, once settled into a fragile peace, found themselves engulfed in a new, more terrifying kind of war. The grim arithmetic of the night's devastation forced a brutal reassessment. Commanders, accustomed to the slow, grinding attrition of artillery duels and the predictable rhythm of infantry assaults, found themselves confronting a new calculus of destruction. The woods, once a familiar sanctuary, had become a tinderbox, and the enemy's sudden, overwhelming application of incendiary ordnance introduced a variable for which no standard doctrine adequately prepared them. Unit after-action reports, compiled in the immediate aftermath, painted a stark picture of the psychological and material impact. The sheer speed of the conflagration, often reaching treetop height within minutes, negated established firefighting protocols and rendered conventional defensive positions untenable. A single company, positioned in a dense pine thicket near Hill 209, reported 70% casualties not from direct enemy fire, but from the rapid spread of the inferno, forcing men to abandon cover and expose themselves to machine gun fire or succumb to smoke inhalation and heat. The scale of the threat demanded an immediate systemic response. Intelligence summaries, Collating observations from forward patrols and aerial reconnaissance confirmed the widespread deployment of phosphorus and magnesium-based munitions, often delivered by modified mortar rounds or artillery shells. The primary mechanism of ignition was a high-temperature chemical reaction, generating intense heat and a persistent, self-sustaining burn that was incredibly difficult to extinguish with the limited resources available at the front. Strategic implications quickly became apparent. The enemy was not merely seeking to dislodge, but to incinerate, to deny terrain through an environmental weapon. This represented a fundamental shift from the attritional warfare that had characterized much of the conflict, moving towards a form of area denial that rendered entire sectors uninhabitable. The psychological toll on troops, witnessing their natural cover turn into a fiery death trap, was immense, eroding morale and fostering a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Divisional command directives, issued with unprecedented urgency, began to outline new tactical considerations. Emphasis was placed on wider dispersal of troops within wooded areas, the creation of fire breaks where feasible, and the urgent development of flame-retardant shelters. The traditional reliance on natural concealment, once a cornerstone of infantry tactics, was now viewed with extreme suspicion, forcing a painful reevaluation of every defensive posture and offensive maneuver planned for forested terrain. The very landscape of battle had been redefined, transforming familiar ground into a potential pyre. The enemy had found a way to weaponize the environment itself, turning the natural world against those who sought refuge within it. This new reality demanded not just adaptation, but a fundamental reimagining of how war was waged in the sylvan shadows. The first light of dawn, creeping over the scarred horizon, illuminated a landscape transformed, not by nature, but by an instantaneous, overwhelming force. Where dense woodland had stood hours before, now lay a shattered, blackened expanse, a testament to the concentrated fury unleashed upon it. Twisted trunks, splintered and still smoldering, jutted from the earth like broken teeth, their branches vaporized or reduced to charcoal dust. The air, thick with the acrid scent of burnt wood and cordite, hung heavy and still, a silent witness to the night's unparalleled violence. Examination of the devastated area by forward reconnaissance teams in the immediate hours after the barrage revealed a consistent pattern of destruction. The trees, primarily mature oaks and pines, exhibited blast damage radiating outwards from multiple points of impact, indicating a broad, overlapping saturation. Shrapnel scars, deep and pervasive, pocked the remaining structures, suggesting a high-explosive fragmentation design, while the widespread charring pointed to incendiary components. The ground itself was churned and cratered, not uniformly, but with distinct clusters of impact, demonstrating a precise targeting of the wooded defensive positions. Damage reports filed by engineer battalions tasked with assessing the impact zone quantified the obliteration. Within the primary target areas, an estimated 95% of all standing timber over 6 inches in diameter had been either felled or rendered unrecognizable. Personnel casualty assessments, though incomplete in the initial hours, indicated a near total loss within the immediate blast radius, with survivors often suffering severe burns and concussive injuries. The sheer scale of the destruction, concentrated within a narrow time frame, presented a stark contrast to the sustained, attritional bombardments typically observed in prior engagements. This deliberate, overwhelming application of firepower represented a strategic shift, moving beyond mere suppression to outright annihilation of entrenched positions. The objective was not to dislodge, but to utterly remove, to erase the tactical advantage afforded by natural cover. It was a brutal calculus, prioritizing speed and decisive effect over prolonged engagement, a direct response to the costly lessons learned in previous attempts to dislodge deeply dug-in forces. The woods, once a sanctuary, had become a tomb, illustrating the new, unforgiving reality of modern combined arms warfare. The silence that followed the inferno was profound, broken only by the distant crackle of lingering embers and the hushed movements of the assessment teams. The lesson was etched into the very earth. No position, however naturally fortified, was immune to a sufficiently concentrated and determined assault. The landscape itself had been weaponized, then unmade in a single, terrifying act. The immediate aftermath of the conflagration forced a stark reevaluation of entrenched defensive strategies, particularly concerning the vulnerability of static positions and the assumed sanctuary of natural cover. The previous reliance on dense woodlands for concealment and anti-tank barriers, a doctrine solidified through decades of trench warfare and early mechanized conflict, was revealed as a profound liability. A new calculus of risk emerged, where the very elements once considered protective now threatened catastrophic immolation. Engineers and tactical planners, poring over charred maps and survivor testimonies, began to codify a revised understanding of battlefield dynamics. The sheer speed of the fire's propagation, documented in unit after-action reports, indicated that traditional firebreak methodologies were insufficient against such an incendiary assault. The concept of a safe rear area, particularly when bordered by extensive vegetation, dissolved under the weight of this new threat. The implications extended beyond immediate defensive postures, influencing the very design of future fortifications and encampments. Production logs from ordnance factories soon reflected a subtle but significant shift in material priorities, with an increased demand for non-combustible construction materials and fire-retardant coatings for equipment. The psychological impact of the fire, the memory of the woods erupting, permeated the planning for subsequent campaigns, influencing everything from bivouac placement to ammunition storage protocols. Training manuals, updated with stark urgency, began to emphasize fire suppression techniques and the rapid creation of clear-cut zones around any static position. The doctrine of camouflage, once paramount, now contended with the counter-doctrine of fire safety, creating a complex tactical dilemma for commanders. The balance between concealment and vulnerability to incendiary attack became a central, often unresolvable tension in battlefield planning. This reevaluation extended to the very nature of offensive operations. The effectiveness of such a widespread incendiary attack, even if unintended in its initial scope, demonstrated a potent new dimension of area denial. The potential for weaponized wildfire, previously a fringe concept, now entered the mainstream of military thought, prompting research into both defensive countermeasures and the ethical implications of such destructive capabilities. The long-term impact manifested in the post-war strategic landscape, where the vulnerability of large contiguous landmasses to fire became a recognized factor in grand strategy. The development of specialized firefighting units within military structures, previously a minor consideration, gained significant institutional backing. The memory of the woods burning, a silent testament to unforeseen